deep in the Montana valleys, where cattle ranches stretched across 800 hectares of untamed land, a young woman named Emma stepped off a bus with nothing but a weathered envelope and a promise from the grave. Her grandmother had left her everything: the sprawling ranch, the herds, and the only home she had ever been meant to call her own. But when Emma made the long journey to claim her inheritance, she found her cousin Derek already living in the main house. He stood on the porch with a cruel smile, holding legal papers that declared him the rightful owner. The livestock bore his brand, and a forged will seemed to make it all legal. How had he stolen everything before she even knew her grandmother was gone? What dark secret gave him the power to erase her from the family legacy? Could she prove the truth before losing the only home she had ever been promised? The Greyhound bus pulled away in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, leaving Emma standing alone at the junction where the paved county road gave way to a rutted dirt track that stretched toward the distant mountains. She was 18 years old, dressed in the only decent clothes she owned, a simple grey sweater and worn jeans from the donation bin at St. Catherine's orphanage, and everything she possessed in the world fit into a single, battered duffel bag slung over her shoulder. In her hand, she clutched a manila envelope that had arrived 3 days after her grandmother's funeral, forwarded through the orphanage's mail system with agonizing slowness. Inside was a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery, the script elegant and shaky, telling her she was loved, she was remembered, and she had a home waiting for her. Tucked behind the letter was a deed, official and heavy with legal language, granting her ownership of 800 hectares of Montana ranchland, the cattle that grazed it, and the house where her grandmother had lived for 50 years. Emma had read the letter so many times the creases were beginning to tear, her fingers tracing the words, as if touch alone could bridge the gap between her lonely childhood and the family she had never known. The walk up the dirt road was long, nearly 3 miles under a pale autumn sun that offered light but little warmth. The landscape opened around her, in vast sweeping vistas of rolling grassland dotted with cattle. The peaks of the Bitterroot Range rising in the west, like the jagged teeth of some ancient sleeping god. It was beautiful, in a way that made her chest ache, a beauty so different from the cramped grey streets of the city where the orphanage sat wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop. When the main house finally came into view, a sprawling 2-story ranch house built from dark logs and riverstone, her heart surged with a hope so fierce it was almost painful. But that hope died the moment she saw the man standing on the wide front porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been told no. He wore expensive boots, dark jeans, and a leather jacket that looked like it cost more than Emma had seen in her entire life, and he watched her approach with a cold, assessing gaze that made her feel like an intruder on her own land. "You must be Emma," he said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "I'm Derek, your cousin. You're wasting your time here." She climbed the porch steps, her legs trembling with exhaustion and nervous energy. "This is my ranch," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "My grandmother left it to me. I have the deed." Derek's laugh was short and cruel. "That old deed doesn't mean anything anymore. Grandmother changed her mind in the end. She realized family meant something after all." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and held it out to her. "This is the will, dated 2 weeks before she died. Everything goes to me. The house, the land, the cattle, all of it. I've been running this place for 3 months now, and I suggest you get back on that bus before you embarrass yourself." Emma took the paper with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the legal text, the official stamps, the signature at the bottom. It was her grandmother's name, Helen Morrison, written in that familiar, elegant script. But as Emma stared at it, something felt wrong. The letters were too uniform, the pressure too even, lacking the slight tremor that had marked her grandmother's handwriting in the letter Emma carried. It was close, heartbreakingly close, but it was not quite right. Derek didn't invite her inside the house that should have been hers. Instead, he pointed toward a low wooden structure beyond the main barn, a bunkhouse that had once housed seasonal workers during the cattle drives of another era. "You can have one night," he said, his tone making it clear this was a mercy he didn't owe her. "I'm not heartless. You've had a long trip, and it's getting dark. But tomorrow morning, I want you gone. If you're still here by noon, I'll call Sheriff Hendricks and have you removed for trespassing." Emma wanted to argue, to scream that this was her land, her inheritance, her birthright. But the words died in her throat when she saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. He believed he had won, and perhaps he had. She nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice, and walked toward the bunkhouse with her duffel bag, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The bunkhouse was cold and spare, a single room with 4 metal-framed beds, a pot-belly stove that hadn't been lit in years, and a small, grimy window that looked out over the fields. She sat on one of the bare mattresses, the springs creaking beneath her weight, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she muffled against her sleeve, the way she had learned to do at the orphanage, where weakness was a currency other children exploited. When the 5 minutes were up, she wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and decided that if she only had one night on her grandmother's land, she would spend it walking every inch she could reach. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, casting long shadows across the grassland. Emma walked past the main barn, a massive structure that smelled of hay and leather, and the warm, earthy scent of horses, past the equipment sheds where tractors and balers sat in neat rows, and toward a series of fenced pastures where cattle grazed in peaceful clusters. The air was clean and sharp, so different from the city, and she breathed it in deeply, trying to memorize the feeling of being here, of standing on land that was connected to her blood, even if the law said otherwise. She was so lost in her thoughts, in the bitter-sweet ache of loving a place she was about to lose, that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a voice spoke behind her. "You're Helen's granddaughter," the voice said, not a question, but a statement of fact tinged with wonder and confusion. Emma turned to find a man standing a few yards away, his weathered face a map of deep lines earned by decades under the Montana sun. He was perhaps in his mid-60s, lean and strong in the way of men who had worked with their hands their entire lives, dressed in worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a faded denim jacket. His hair was steel grey beneath a sweat-stained cowboy hat, and his dark eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since her grandmother's last visit to the orphanage 6 years ago. "I'm Miguel Reyes," he continued, his voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of a heritage that had worked this land long before it had official deeds and legal papers. "I've been foreman here for 30 years. Your grandmother, she kept photographs of you everywhere, talked about you all the time. I'd know your face anywhere." He took a step closer, his expression shifting from recognition to something darker, a confusion that bordered on distress. "But what are you doing out here in the cold? Why aren't you in the main house? Why is Derek acting like he owns the place when Helen always said, always promised, that everything would go to you?" Emma felt something break open inside her chest, a flood of validation and grief so powerful it made her knees weak. She sat down heavily on a nearby fence rail, and Miguel, reading her distress with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life understanding the unspoken language of struggling creatures, sat beside her with a respectful distance between them. "She talked about me?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper, because in all her years at St. Catherine's, she had wondered if she had been forgotten, if she had been just another obligation to a woman who had visited 3 times in 18 years, and then stopped coming altogether. Miguel nodded, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Every single day, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, she would sit on that porch in her rocking chair, especially in those last few months when the sickness was taking her strength, and she would tell me about you. She said you were smart, that you loved books, that you drew pictures of mountains and horses, even though you'd never seen either one up close. She said the ranch would go to you, that it was always meant to go to you, that you were the future of this place, and she was just keeping it safe until you were old enough to claim it. He paused, his jaw tightening with visible frustration. That's why none of this makes any sense. Derek showed up the day after her funeral, with 2 lawyers in expensive suits and a briefcase full of papers. He had a will, all official and stamped, dated just 2 weeks before she passed, leaving everything to him. The lawyer, Marcus Brennan, he's known around here, got his fingers in a lot of pies, if you know what I mean, and he told me and the other hands that Derek was the new owner, and we'd be taking orders from him from now on. Miguel turned to look at Emma directly, his dark eyes searching her face, as if trying to understand how such an injustice could have occurred. But here's the thing that's been eating at me for 3 months now. Your grandmother, she was sharp as a tack right up until the very end. Yeah, she was weak, couldn't get out of bed those last 2 weeks, needed a nurse to help her with everything, but her mind was clear. I talked to her 3 days before she died, and she grabbed my hand with whatever strength she had left and said, "Miguel, when Emma comes home, you help her. You teach her everything. This place is hers." Those were almost her exact last words to me. He looked away, his voice thickening with emotion. So when Derek showed up acting like king of the castle, I didn't believe it. I asked to see the will, and he showed it to me. But something felt wrong. The timing was wrong. The whole situation was wrong. But what could I do? I'm just the foreman. I don't have lawyers or money to fight. Derek started making changes immediately, selling off some of the prime breeding stock, talking to developers about water rights, treating this place like it was his personal bank account to drain. Miguel stood up, his decision made, and looked down at Emma with the same fierce protective loyalty he must have shown her grandmother. "Derek told you to sleep in the bunkhouse and be gone by morning, didn't he? That's not happening. There's a guest cabin on the east side of the property, about a 1/4 mile from the main house. It's small, but it's clean, has running water, a wood stove, and a real bed. Your grandmother used it when she had visitors she actually liked. You're staying there, and you're staying as long as you need to. Figure this out. I owe that much to Helen's memory, and I owe it to you." Miguel led Emma through the gathering darkness to the guest cabin, a small structure tucked beneath a grove of towering ponderosa pines, whose needles carpeted the ground in a thick, fragrant layer that muffled their footsteps. He showed her how to work the wood stove, how to prime the old hand pump at the sink, and where he had stored emergency supplies of canned food and blankets in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. "I'll bring you fresh supplies in the morning," he said, his weathered face gentle in the lamplight. "Don't let Derek intimidate you. You have every right to be here, legal papers or not." After he left, Emma stood in the center of the small room, taking in her surroundings with a mix of exhaustion and cautious wonder. The cabin was simple but well-maintained, a single room with a brass bed covered in a faded quilt, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf crammed with old paperbacks, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. It smelled of pine and old wood, and something else, something faint and floral, that made Emma's throat tighten, because she recognized it as her grandmother's perfume, a scent she remembered from those rare visits when she was small enough to be held. She couldn't sleep, not with everything churning in her mind, so she began to explore, opening drawers and cabinets with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space. Most contained the expected items, spare linens, kitchen utensils, a few dishes, but it was the bookshelf that drew her attention. The volumes were old, their spines cracked and faded, titles like Lonesome Dove and Centennial, and all the pretty horses, the kind of Western literature her grandmother must have loved. Emma ran her fingers along the spines, and when she reached for a thick volume titled The Complete Works of Robert Frost, something felt wrong about its weight. She pulled it from the shelf, and the moment she opened it, she understood why. The book had been hollowed out, its pages carefully cut away to create a hidden compartment, and nestled inside were 3 leather-bound journals, each one filled with her grandmother's elegant, slightly shaky handwriting. Emma carried them to the table, lit a second lamp to drive back the darkness, and opened the first journal with trembling hands. The entries began 3 years ago, starting with mundane observations about the weather, the cattle, the changing seasons. But as Emma read deeper into the year, the tone shifted. Her grandmother wrote about doctor's visits, about tests that revealed a heart condition, about medications that made her tired and confused, about the creeping awareness that time was no longer infinite. But woven through every entry, appearing again and again like a refrain, were references to Emma. I must make sure Emma knows she is loved. The ranch will be Emma's legacy. I need to update the will to make everything clear for Emma. I pray Emma forgives me for the years I stayed away, for believing the orphanage was safer than bringing her here, where Derek's bitterness might have touched her. Emma read through tears that blurred the ink, her heart breaking and mending with every page, learning that she had been loved, deeply and constantly, by a woman who had made the agonizing choice to keep her at a distance to protect her. The second journal continued in the same vein, documenting her grandmother's declining health, but also her fierce determination to preserve the ranch for Emma's future. And then Emma reached the final journal, the entries from the last 3 months of her grandmother's life. And the tone changed completely. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries shorter, filled with a growing anxiety that radiated off the page. Emma's hands shook as she read the entry from 3 weeks before her grandmother's death. Derek has been here again today, the 3rd time this week. He keeps asking about the will, about my plans for the estate, pressing me with questions that feel less like concern and more like interrogation. He brought that lawyer, Marcus Brennan, with him, the one who always smells of expensive cologne and cheaper morals. They sat in my living room, talking about my mortality, as if I weren't even there. Derek's eyes are cold when he looks at me now, calculating, and I realize with a sick certainty that he sees me not as family, but as an obstacle between him and something he believes he deserves. Emma woke at dawn to the sound of Miguel's truck rumbling up the narrow path to the guest cabin, its engine a low, comforting sound in the crisp morning air. He brought her fresh milk, eggs, bread, and a thermos of strong black coffee, setting them on the small table with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood the power of small kindnesses. She showed him the journals, watching his weathered face darken as he read the final entries, his calloused fingers turning the pages with a gentleness that spoke of deep respect. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally, his voice tight with anger and regret. "Those last few weeks, Derek was here constantly, always with that snake of a lawyer, always disappearing into your grandmother's room for private conversations. She had a nurse taking care of her, a woman named Sarah Collins, young thing maybe in her late 20s, seemed competent enough, but always looked nervous, like she was carrying a secret that weighed on her." He set the journal down and met Emma's gaze with the directness of a man delivering hard truth. "Sarah was here every day for the final month, living in a room off the kitchen, handling your grandmother's medications, helping her with everything she couldn't do herself. But here's what's strange. The day after the funeral, Sarah packed her things and disappeared. Didn't give notice, didn't say goodbye to anyone, just loaded her car before dawn and drove off. I tried calling her a few days later because she'd left some of her medical supplies behind, but her phone was disconnected. It was like she vanished into thin air." Emma felt a cold certainty settle in her chest the pieces of a dark puzzle beginning to fit together. "Did she seem frightened?" she asked. Miguel considered the question carefully. "Not frightened exactly, more like conflicted. I saw her crying in the kitchen once, about a week before your grandmother passed. When I asked if she was all right, she just said she wished things were different, that some choices were impossible. At the time, I thought she was just sad about losing a patient. But now, knowing what was happening with Derek and that lawyer, I wonder if she saw something, knew something she wasn't supposed to." After Miguel left to handle the morning chores, Emma returned to the journals, reading more carefully this time, looking for any mention of Sarah Collins. She found scattered references throughout the final weeks. Sarah is kind but seems troubled. Sarah tried to give me extra medication today, but I refused. Something felt wrong about her insistence. I heard Sarah on the phone late last night. Her voice was pleading. She kept saying, "I can't do this. It's not right." And then, on a piece of loose paper, tucked between the last pages, Emma found what she was looking for. A phone number, written in her grandmother's shaky hand, with a single word beside it. Sarah, if needed. The number had a Montana area code, but a different prefix, suggesting it was from another county or town. Emma stared at the number, her heart pounding with the weight of decision. This woman had been present during her grandmother's final days, had witnessed whatever had happened in that house, had fled as if pursued by something terrible. She might be the only person who knew the truth about the will, about Derek's visits, about the circumstances that had stolen Emma's inheritance. But she had also disconnected her phone and disappeared, which meant she was either hiding or had been silenced. Emma pulled out the cheap prepaid phone she had bought at a gas station with her last $20, a phone with limited minutes and no internet, and carefully dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and she was about to give up when a woman's voice answered, breathless and frightened. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. "My name is Emma Morrison. Helen Morrison was my grandmother. I think you knew her. I think you know what happened. Please, I need your help." Sarah Collins had hung up immediately after Emma identified herself, and the line going dead with a click that felt like a door slamming. But the fact that the number still worked, that someone had answered at all, gave Emma a thread of hope to cling to. She would try again, but first she needed to understand the legal landscape she was fighting against, needed to see the official records, and confront the man who had supposedly helped her grandmother change her mind in those final weeks. The county clerk's office was in the town of Hamilton, a 30-mile drive that Emma made in Miguel's borrowed truck, the old engine rattling, but reliable as it carried her down from the mountain valleys into the small cluster of buildings that served as the county seat. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain and a nameplate that read Dorothy Chen, was polite but firm when Emma explained what she needed. The will was filed properly, Dorothy said, pulling up records on an ancient computer that hummed and whirred like it might expire at any moment. Dated October 3rd, filed October 24th, the day after Helen Morrison's death. Everything appears to be in order, witnessed and notarized by Marcus Brennan, attorney at law. Emma leaned over the counter, her voice low and urgent. "Can I see the original? Can I see the actual signed document?" Dorothy's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "The original is held by the attorney of record. We only have certified copies here. If you want to challenge the will, you'll need to file a formal contest through your own lawyer. But I have to warn you, that's expensive and difficult, especially when everything appears legitimate on paper." Emma took the address for Marcus Brennan's office, a location on the better side of Hamilton in a restored Victorian house that had been converted into professional suites, the kind of place that announced success and respectability. She found his office on the 2nd floor, past a brass nameplate that gleamed with fresh polish, and entered a reception area decorated with expensive leather furniture and original oil paintings of Montana landscapes that probably cost more than Emma had seen in her entire life. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a voice like chilled honey, informed her that Mr. Brennan did not take walk-in appointments. But before Emma could argue, a door opened and Marcus Brennan himself appeared. He was a man in his early 50s, tall and distinguished, with silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once, before softness and self-indulgence had blurred its lines. He wore a suit that looked custom-tailored, and his smile was the practiced expression of a man who sold reassurance for a living. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice smooth and professionally warm, "I wondered if you might appear. Please, come into my office." She followed him into a spacious room, dominated by a massive mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes that looked more decorative than functional. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and sat down with the easy confidence of a man on his own territory. "I assume you're here about your grandmother's estate," he began before Emma could speak. "Let me save us both some time. The will was drafted according to your grandmother's explicit wishes, properly witnessed, properly executed. She was of sound mind, evaluated by her physician, and she made her decision freely. I understand this is difficult for you, but the law is clear." Emma pulled out a photocopy of her grandmother's letter, the one that had brought her to Montana, and placed it on his desk. "This letter is dated a week after the will you claim she signed. In it, she tells me the ranch is mine, that she's leaving everything to me. How do you explain that?" Marcus barely glanced at the letter, his expression cooling. "People change their minds, Miss Morrison. Perhaps she wrote that letter in a moment of sentimentality, and then reconsidered. Or perhaps you forged it. Either way, it has no legal bearing on the properly executed will." Emma leaned forward, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "The signature on the will doesn't look right. I want it examined by a handwriting expert. I want the original document tested." The warmth vanished completely from Marcus Brennan's face, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "Be very careful, Miss Morrison. Questioning the validity of a legal document, accusing an officer of the court of impropriety. These are serious matters that could result in charges of harassment or even slander. You're a young woman with no resources, no representation, and no standing in this community. I suggest you accept reality and move on before you find yourself in legal trouble you cannot afford." Emma's eyes swept the office, taking in details she had missed before. The artwork that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars, the vintage whiskey on a sideboard that probably cost more per bottle than most people made in a week, and there, on the credenza behind his desk, a framed photograph of Marcus Brennan and Derek standing together in hunting gear, rifles in hand, arms around each other's shoulders, like old friends celebrating a successful kill. Emma left Marcus Brennan's office with her hands shaking and her mind racing, the implicit threat hanging over her like a dark cloud. But beneath the fear was a burning anger that grew hotter with every step she took down the Victorian staircase and out onto the street. She needed time to think, to process what she had learned, and so she walked aimlessly through Hamilton's small downtown until she found herself standing in front of a diner called the Copper Kettle, its neon sign flickering in the grey afternoon light, promising coffee and comfort in equal measure. The interior was exactly what she needed, warm, worn, and unpretentious, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with swivel stools, and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon hanging in the air like a benediction. Emma slid into a booth near the window, her body suddenly heavy with the exhaustion of the past 3 days, and a moment later an elderly waitress appeared with a coffee pot and a smile that carried genuine warmth. The woman was perhaps in her early 70s, small and spare with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a uniform that had probably been the same style for 40 years, and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had worked hard her entire life and found purpose in it. Her name tag read Ruth, and when she looked at Emma, really looked at her, Something shifted in her expression, from professional courtesy to startled recognition. "Good Lord," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're Helen's granddaughter. You look just like her when she was young. Same eyes, same stubborn chin." She set the coffee pot down on the table and slid into the booth across from Emma without asking permission, her weathered hands reaching out to grasp Emma's with surprising strength. "I'm Ruth Calloway. Your grandmother and I were friends for over 30 years. We played cards every Thursday, went to church every Sunday, and told each other everything that mattered. I was at her funeral, cried like a baby, and I've been waiting for you to come home ever since, because Helen talked about nothing else in those final months." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness, at the validation that she had been real to her grandmother, not just a distant obligation, but a constant presence in her thoughts. "Derek says she changed her will," Emma said, her voice breaking. "He says she left everything to him." Ruth's face transformed, the warmth draining away and replaced by a fury so intense it seemed to crackle in the air between them. "That's a damned lie," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Pardon my language, but that's exactly what it is. 2 months ago, maybe the first week of August, Helen asked me to come out to the ranch. She was already weak by then, spending most of her days in bed, but her mind was sharp as ever. She showed me her will, had me witness her signature on an updated copy she was sending to a lawyer in Missoula for safekeeping. I read it with my own eyes. Everything, and I mean everything, the land, the house, the cattle, the bank accounts, all of it was going to you, Emma Morrison, her beloved granddaughter." Ruth's grip on Emma's hands tightened. She told me she was worried about Derek. He'd been coming around more and more, always needing money, always with some story about investments gone bad or debts he needed to cover. She said he had a gambling problem, that he owed money to dangerous people, that he'd asked her for $50,000, and she'd refused. She was afraid of what he might do, afraid of how desperate he was becoming. Ruth paused, her eyes searching Emma's face. "She made me promise that if anything happened to her, anything suspicious, I would find you and tell you the truth. She said Derek was capable of terrible things when he was cornered, and I think she knew, somewhere deep down, that he was planning something." Emma pulled out her grandmother's journals and the letter, spreading them on the table between them, and Ruth read them with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her finger tracing the familiar handwriting of a friend she would never see again. Ruth sat back in the booth, her expression shifting from grief to something harder and more determined, the look of a woman who had lived through difficult times and knew how to fight back when justice demanded it. "I have a friend at Mountain Valley Bank," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Frank Hutchins, been the branch manager there for 20 years. He handled all of Helen's accounts, knew her well, and I know for a fact he was troubled by some transactions in those final weeks. He mentioned it to me at the funeral, said something felt wrong, but his hands were tied by privacy laws. But you're Helen's heir, or at least you should be, which means you have a right to see those records." An hour later, Emma and Ruth sat in Frank Hutchins's small office at the back of the bank, a cluttered space filled with family photographs and community service awards that spoke of a man deeply rooted in the place he served. Frank was a thin, nervous man in his late 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful demeanor of someone who took rules seriously, but knew when those rules were being used to hide something wrong. He pulled up Helen Morrison's account records on his computer, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard before he turned the screen so Emma could see. "I shouldn't be showing you this," he said quietly, "but your grandmother was a good woman, and what I saw here never sat right with me." Emma leaned forward, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers, the neat digital record of her grandmother's final months reduced to debits and credits. What she saw made her stomach clench with cold fury. Starting 6 weeks before her grandmother's death, there were cash withdrawals, large ones, occurring every few days with increasing frequency. $5,000 on September 12th, another $7,000 on September 18th, $10,000 on September 25th, and then a series of smaller withdrawals, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, all adding up to a staggering total of nearly $50,000 withdrawn in cash over the course of a single month. Frank pointed to the dates with a pen, his hand trembling slightly. These withdrawals were all done in person at the teller window, supposedly by your grandmother. But here's what bothers me. Helen hadn't been physically able to come into the bank for over a year before she died. We had arrangements for Miguel to deposit ranch income, but she never withdrew large amounts of cash. These transactions were done by someone presenting a power of attorney document, and the signature on that document was supposedly hers, but I never quite believed it. Ruth pulled out her phone and began comparing the withdrawal dates with a small calendar she kept in her purse. "Look at this," she said, her voice tight. "Every single one of these dates matches the days Derek was at the ranch. I know because Helen would call me afterward, upset, saying he'd been pressuring her again. He was either stealing directly from her accounts or forcing her to hand over the money, bleeding her dry while she was too weak to fight back." Emma stared at the numbers, at the systematic draining of her grandmother's life savings, and understood with terrible clarity that Derek hadn't just stolen her inheritance through a forged will. He had been robbing her grandmother blind in her final days, taking advantage of her weakness, her isolation, and her fear. Emma returned to the ranch that evening to find her path blocked by a massive tractor positioned directly across the narrow road leading to the guest cabin, its bulk impossible to navigate around in Miguel's borrowed truck. 2 ranch hands she didn't recognize stood nearby, smoking cigarettes, and watching her with expressions of calculated indifference. When she asked them to move the equipment, they shrugged and said they were on break, that the tractor had engine trouble, that it would be moved eventually, their words dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from following orders they found amusing. She was forced to park a quarter-mile away and walk to the cabin carrying supplies Ruth had given her, and when she finally reached the small structure, she discovered the water had been shut off at the main line and the propane tank for the stove had been emptied. It was petty, cruel, and unmistakably deliberate, Derek's way of making her life unbearable without technically breaking any laws. The campaign intensified over the next few days. Emma woke one morning to find all 4 tires on Miguel's truck slashed, the rubber shredded so thoroughly they couldn't be repaired. When she walked to the main house to confront Derek, he was standing on the porch with a coffee mug and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, claiming he knew nothing about it, suggesting that perhaps she had made enemies in town, that people didn't take kindly to con artists trying to steal inheritances from legitimate heirs. That afternoon, Emma went into Hamilton to buy supplies and found the atmosphere had changed. The friendly clerk at the hardware store was suddenly cold and suspicious, asking her to pay cash up front instead of extending the credit she offered other ranchers. At the Copper Kettle, she overheard 2 women in the next booth talking about the troubled orphan girl who was harassing poor Derek Morrison, making wild accusations about forged wills, that she probably had mental problems from her difficult childhood. The rumors had spread like poison through the small community, carefully planted and meticulously cultivated to isolate her. Miguel became her lifeline, appearing each evening after Derek had gone into town, bringing water in large containers, firewood he'd split himself, and information gathered from the few ranch hands who still felt loyalty to Helen Morrison's memory. He told her that Derek had been making calls, that men in expensive trucks had been visiting the ranch late at night, that he'd overheard conversations about making problems disappear. "Derek owes money to people you don't want to meet," Miguel said one night, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "Gambling debts to an organization that operates out of Spokane. The kind of people who don't forgive and don't forget. That $50,000 he took from your grandmother probably went straight to them, and it still wasn't enough. He needs this ranch, needs to sell it or leverage it, and he sees you as the only thing standing between him and survival. Desperate men do desperate things, Emma. You need to be careful." Emma called the number every day for a week, sometimes twice a day, letting it ring until voicemail picked up, leaving messages that grew increasingly desperate as she explained who she was, what Tommy needed, why Sarah's testimony might be the only thing that could reveal the truth about her grandmother's final days. Each time, the calls went unanswered, the silence on the other end feeling like a wall she couldn't breach, until finally, on the 8th day, late in the evening, when Emma had almost given up hope, Sarah Collins answered. Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. "Stop calling this number. You don't understand what you're asking. These people, they're dangerous, and if they know I talked to you, I don't know what they'll do." Emma gripped the phone tighter, her own voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Sarah, please. Helen Morrison was my grandmother. She wanted to leave everything to me, and someone stole it. I think you know what happened in that house. I think you saw something." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing, and then she spoke again, her voice cracking with emotion. "She was a good woman. She didn't deserve what they did to her. She kept saying your name, kept asking for you, and I couldn't do anything to help her, because I was scared, because they paid me $10,000 to keep my mouth shut and leave town." Emma heard the sound of crying, soft and broken. "I've been carrying this guilt for 3 months. Can't sleep, can't stop seeing her face." Emma pressed her advantage gently, knowing she was close to breaking through. "Then help me now. Help me finish what she started. Meet me somewhere. Tell me what you saw, and we can make this right together." Another long pause, and Emma could almost hear the internal battle Sarah was fighting, the war between fear and conscience. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice steadier now, as if the decision had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying. "There's a truck stop on Interstate 90, just past the Idaho border, a place called Mineral Junction. It's 2 counties away from Hamilton, far enough that no one will recognize us. I can meet you there tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. Park in the back near the diesel pumps, and come alone. If I see anyone else, if I think you've told anyone where you're going, I'll disappear, and you'll never find me again." Emma agreed immediately, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "How will I recognize you?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and sad. "I'll be the woman who looks like she hasn't slept in 3 months. And Emma, be careful. Derek has people watching you, and if he finds out you're meeting me, he'll do whatever it takes to stop us both." Emma drove through the night and into the following morning, the borrowed truck rattling over mountain passes and down into valleys, the landscape shifting from Montana's familiar peaks into the rolling hills of eastern Idaho. She told no one where she was going, not even Miguel, understanding that Sarah's paranoia was warranted, and that any leak could destroy her one chance at the truth. Mineral Junction was exactly as Sarah had described, a sprawling truck stop that served the long-haul drivers who moved freight across the western states, anonymous and perpetually busy with strangers passing through. Emma parked near the diesel pumps as instructed, and waited, her hands gripping the steering wheel, so tightly her knuckles turned white. 20 minutes later, a small Honda pulled in beside her, and a woman stepped out who looked like she'd aged a decade in 3 months. Sarah Collins was probably 30, but looked 40, her face drawn and pale, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and crushing guilt. She didn't speak, just gestured for Emma to follow her inside to a back booth in the attached diner, a place where the noise of the trucks and the chatter of travelers would mask their conversation. They sat across from each other, and Sarah started talking before Emma could even ask a question, the words pouring out like she'd been holding them back for so long they could no longer be contained. "Your grandmother was a fighter," Sarah began, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she didn't drink. Even at the end, even when the cancer was eating her alive and the pain medications made everything foggy, she was clear about one thing. You were getting the ranch. She talked about you constantly, showed me pictures, made plans for when you'd come home. But Derek knew that, and he couldn't let it happen. Sarah's voice dropped lower, her eyes darting around the diner, as if expecting to see Derek's men materialize from the shadows. 3 weeks before she died, Derek came to the house with Marcus Brennan. Your grandmother was in bed, weak and confused from the medications I'd given her that morning. Medications Derek had specifically asked me to increase. They brought papers, a new will, and when she tried to refuse, when she tried to tell them to leave, Derek leaned close to her and said something I'll never forget. Sarah pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. He told her that he had connections at the state level, friends who controlled funding for social services, and that if she didn't sign, he would make sure St. Catherine's orphanage lost its accreditation and you'd be transferred to a state facility known for abuse and neglect. He described it in detail, told her exactly what would happen to you, and she broke. She signed while crying, begging him not to hurt you, and I stood there and did nothing, because I was terrified. Sarah turned her phone screen toward Emma, tears streaming down her face. But I recorded it. I recorded everything. Sarah placed her phone on the table between them, her finger hovering over the play button with the hesitation of someone about to open a door that could never be closed again. "I'm sorry you have to hear this," she whispered, and then she pressed play, and Emma's world shattered into something sharp and jagged that cut with every word. The recording began with rustling sounds, the scrape of chairs, and then voices, distant at first, but growing clearer. Emma recognized Marcus Brennan's smooth, professional tone, saying something about legal procedures and proper execution of documents, his words meant to sound official and reassuring. Then came a voice that made Emma's breath catch in her throat, weak and tremulous, but unmistakably her grandmother's, the voice she remembered from childhood visits, now stripped of its strength and vitality by illness and fear. "I don't understand why this is necessary," her grandmother said, each word an effort. "I already have a will. Everything is supposed to go to Emma. I promised her." There was a pause, and then Derek's voice cut through, and it was a voice Emma barely recognized, stripped of the false civility he'd shown her on the porch, revealing something cold and reptilian underneath. "Aunt Helen, we've been through this. That old will doesn't reflect reality. You need proper care, expensive care, and the ranch needs to be managed by someone who knows what they're doing. Emma is just a child, an orphan with no experience, no education, nothing. She'll run this place into the ground within a year." Her grandmother's response was stronger, a flash of the woman she must have been before illness diminished her. "Emma is smart, and she's strong, and this land is her birthright. I won't change my mind, Derek. Now please leave, and let me rest." What happened next made Emma's hands ball into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Derek's voice changed, dropping lower, taking on a tone of calculated cruelty. "Let me explain something to you, Aunt Helen. I have friends in the state government, people who oversee social services and orphanage funding. St. Catherine's, that place where Emma lives, it operates on a very thin margin. One phone call from the right person, one accusation of improper conduct or financial mismanagement, and that place loses its accreditation. Do you know what happens to the children when an orphanage closes?" There was silence, and then her grandmother's voice, now trembling with terror. "No, please, don't," Derek continued, relentless. "They get transferred to state facilities, places that are overcrowded and underfunded, places where vulnerable children disappear into the system, and nobody cares what happens to them. Is that what you want for Emma? Do you want her spending her final years as a minor in a place where she'll be forgotten, and possibly worse?" Emma heard the sound of her grandmother crying, soft broken sobs that tore at her heart. "Please don't hurt Emma. She has nothing. She needs this place. She needs to have a home." Derek's voice was ice. "Then sign the paper, Aunt Helen. Sign it, and Emma will be fine at the orphanage until she's 18. Fight me, and I'll make sure she suffers." Emma left Mineral Junction with Sarah's recordings secured on a USB drive hidden in her jacket pocket. But she knew digital evidence alone might not be enough. Not when Derek had Marcus Brennan, and probably a judge or two in his pocket. Not when the entire system seemed designed to protect men like him who had money and connections. She needed the original will, the one her grandmother had shown Ruth, the one that predated Derek's forgery. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that if it still existed, it would be in the main house, hidden somewhere her grandmother had thought safe from Derek's searching. She watched the ranch for 2 days, learning Derek's patterns, and on the third day, when she saw his expensive truck disappear down the road toward Hamilton, she made her move. The main house's back door was locked, but the window to the mudroom had a broken latch that Miguel had mentioned needing repair, and Emma slipped through it with her heart hammering against her ribs, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She moved quickly through rooms that should have felt familiar, but instead felt violated, Derek's presence evident in the expensive liquor bottles on the sideboard, the scattered papers detailing property appraisals and development deals, the general disorder of a man who treated the place like a temporary asset rather than a home. Her grandmother's bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway, and when Emma pushed open the door, she was struck by how preserved it was, as if Derek couldn't quite bring himself to erase this final evidence of the woman he'd terrorized. The furniture was exactly as it must have been, a 4-poster bed with a faded quilt, a dresser covered in framed photographs of Emma at various ages, and on the wall across from the bed, a large oil portrait of her grandmother as a young woman, beautiful and strong, painted decades before illness had diminished her. Emma approached the portrait, studying it with new eyes, and noticed something odd about the way it hung, a slight gap between the frame and the wall on one side. She lifted the heavy frame carefully, and behind it was a wall safe, old and sturdy, with a combination lock. Emma's mind raced through possibilities, and then she remembered the date her grandmother had written in her journal over and over, the date that seemed to hold special significance. Emma's birthday, April 15th, 2007, the day Emma was born. She spun the dial with trembling fingers. 04, 15, 07, and the lock clicked open. Inside was everything she needed. The original will dated 2 years earlier, naming Emma as sole heir. Medical records from 3 different doctors showing her grandmother had been prescribed incorrect medications that would cause confusion and cognitive impairment, and a handwritten letter on cream stationery that began, "My dearest Emma, forgive me for my weakness." Emma was reading her grandmother's letter, tears streaming down her face as the words of love and apology washed over her, when she heard the sound that turned her blood to ice. The rumble of Derek's truck returning far earlier than expected, the engine growing louder as it approached the main house. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he would be inside, and there was no way to reach the mudroom window without crossing directly through his line of sight. She shoved the documents back into the safe, closed it, repositioned the portrait, and ran to the bedroom's main closet, pulling the door nearly shut and pressing herself into the shadows among her grandmother's old coats that still smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. Through the crack in the door, she watched Derek enter the bedroom, his face flushed with anger, and he moved directly to the portrait, lifting it away from the wall with rough hands that showed no respect for the painted image of the woman who had raised him. He spun the combination lock, and Emma's heart sank as she realized he knew about the safe, had probably been checking it regularly to ensure the evidence of his crime remained secure. But when the safe door swung open and Derek looked inside, his entire body went rigid, and he let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Something was wrong. Something was missing that should have been there. and Emma realized with creeping horror that he must have taken the original documents out at some point, hidden them somewhere else, and what she had found were copies her grandmother had made, insurance against exactly this kind of theft. Derek pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "She's been in the house. The safe was accessed. I don't know what she found, but we can't take any chances. Call Hendricks and tell him to handle this now." An hour later, Emma was back in the guest cabin when she heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked out to see a sheriff's department cruiser pulling up, followed closely by Derek's truck. Sheriff Tom Hendricks was a large man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, before corruption and comfortable living had softened it into something doughy and weak. He wore his uniform like a costume, the badge polished to a high shine, and he walked with the swagger of a man who believed his authority was absolute. Derek stood beside him, his expression a carefully crafted mask of concerned innocence. "Miss Morrison," Sheriff Hendricks said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician addressing constituents, "I've received a report of criminal trespass and possible theft. Mr. Morrison here says you broke into his home and accessed private property without permission." Emma stood on the cabin's small porch, the documents she'd copied hidden in her jacket, and met the sheriff's gaze with all the courage she could muster. "This isn't his home. It's mine. My grandmother left it to me, and he stole it through coercion and elder abuse." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but Emma saw the flicker of something in his eyes that told her he already knew whose side he was on. "Do you have proof of these allegations? Because what I have is a legally executed will, filed with the county, and what you have is a history of making trouble." He pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "This is an official notice. You have 24 hours to vacate this property. If you're still here after that, I'll arrest you for trespassing. And given your accusations against a respected member of this community, I might also charge you with harassment and defamation. Pack your things and leave, Miss Morrison, before this gets worse for you." That night, after the sheriff's cruiser had disappeared down the dirt road, and Derek had returned to the main house with a triumphant smirk, Miguel appeared at the guest cabin door with an urgency Emma had never seen in him before. "Pack everything important," he said, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. "We need to go somewhere Derek can't follow, somewhere we can talk without being overheard." They drove in Miguel's truck for nearly an hour, leaving the main ranch buildings far behind, following rutted two-track roads that wound through dense stands of pine and across high meadows where the grass grew tall and wild. Finally, they reached a small structure tucked into a fold of the mountains, a line shack that had been used for generations by cowboys watching over cattle during the summer grazing season. It was primitive, just 4 walls and a roof, a wood stove, and a single cot, but it was isolated and secure, a place where secrets could be shared without fear of discovery. Inside, Miguel lit a kerosene lamp and pulled a large, weatherproof box from beneath the cot, the kind of container designed to protect valuable items from the elements. "I've been documenting everything," he said, opening the box to reveal a treasure trove of evidence organized with meticulous care. "From the day Derek showed up claiming to be the owner, I knew something was wrong, and I knew eventually someone would come looking for the truth. I was hoping it would be you." He spread the contents across the rough wooden table, photographs taken with a camera that had a date stamp showing Derek loading prime breeding cattle into trucks on the same cattle that had been specifically mentioned in Helen's original will as the foundation stock of the herd, animals worth tens of thousands of dollars that Derek had sold off for quick cash. There were copies of tax documents Miguel had obtained from a sympathetic clerk at the county assessor's office, documents showing Derek had falsified the ranch's income reports, claiming losses when the operation was actually profitable, setting up a situation where he could justify selling off assets. Most damning of all were contracts and correspondence Miguel had photographed, evidence that Derek had illegally sold water rights to Cascade Development Corporation, of the same massive agribusiness concern that had been trying to consolidate small ranches into corporate holdings for years. Your grandmother fought them for decades, Miguel explained, his voice thick with emotion. She believed in family ranches, in keeping the land in the hands of people who loved it, rather than corporations that only saw profit margins. Those water rights were specifically protected in her original will, marked as inalienable, never to be sold or transferred. Derek violated that within a month of taking control, and the money he got, over $100,000, it's gone, gambled away, or paid to his creditors. Emma returned to the guest cabin before dawn, with Miguel's evidence stored carefully in a backpack. And by the time the sun crested the mountains, she had Ruth sitting at the small table, helping her organize everything into a coherent narrative that could be presented to someone with the power to fight back. They worked for hours, creating a timeline that started with Derek's gambling debts and his grandmother's refusal to bail him out, then moved through the systematic coercion, the falsified will, the theft of assets, and the illegal sale of water rights, each claim supported by documents, photographs, or recordings that transformed accusations into irrefutable fact. Ruth, who had worked as a legal secretary in her younger years, before life had led her to waitressing, understood the importance of presentation, and she helped Emma create a packet that was professional, organized, and devastating in its clarity. By afternoon, they had compiled a case that would make any honest lawyer's eyes light up with the promise of justice, and Ruth made a phone call to a woman she'd heard about through the state advocacy network, a lawyer named Jennifer Martinez, who had built her reputation on taking down corrupt estate attorneys and defending the vulnerable against predators who saw the elderly as easy marks. Jennifer practiced in Helena, the state capital, 200 miles away, far enough from Hamilton's local politics that Derek's influence couldn't reach her. When Ruth explained the situation, Jennifer's assistant said she was in court, but would call back within the hour, and when the phone rang, exactly 53 minutes later, Emma found herself speaking with a woman whose voice carried the steel of someone who had fought battles in courtrooms and won more than she'd lost. "Tell me everything," Jennifer said, and Emma did, her words spilling out in a torrent of anger and grief and desperate hope. She described the recordings, the forged will, the medical records, Miguel's documentation, the bank withdrawals, the threats, and the systematic campaign to drive her off land that was rightfully hers. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Jennifer spoke with quiet intensity. "This is textbook elder abuse and estate fraud. The coercion alone is enough to invalidate the will, but combined with everything else, this is one of the clearest cases I've seen in 15 years of practice. I'm taking this pro bono, because cases like this are exactly why I went to law school. And I promise you, Emma, we're going to make this right." Within 3 hours, Jennifer had reviewed digital copies of every document Emma sent, and by end of business that day, she had filed an emergency injunction with the district court in Missoula, a jurisdiction outside Hamilton's sphere of influence, requesting that all ranch assets be frozen pending a full investigation into the circumstances of Helen Morrison's will and the subsequent disposal of estate property. And when the judge reviewed the evidence packet, he granted the injunction immediately, effective at midnight. The injunction hit Derek like a physical blow, and Emma heard about his reaction from one of the ranch hands who still secretly supported her, a young man who called from a gas station payphone to warn her that Derek had gone into a rage when the sheriff served him the court papers, throwing furniture and screaming threats that made even his hired men nervous. The explosion came the next morning when Miguel arrived for work, as he had every day for 30 years, and Derek was waiting for him in the yard with 2 large men Emma had never seen before, outsiders with the hard faces and cold eyes of people who hurt others for money. Derek's voice carried across the property, loud enough that Emma heard it from the guest cabin. "You're fired, old man. Pack your shit and get off my property." Miguel stood his ground, his weathered face calm, but his voice firm with decades of earned authority. "This isn't your property, and you can't fire me. I work for the Morrison family, and Emma is a Morrison." What happened next was brutal and swift. The two hired men moved on Derek's signal, and while Miguel was strong for his age, he was still a man in his 60s, facing two younger, larger attackers who had no compunction about violence. They grabbed him, and when he tried to pull away, one of them drove a fist into his ribs with a sickening crack that Emma heard from 50 yards away. She ran toward them, screaming, but by the time she reached the yard, Miguel was on the ground, curled in pain, and Derek was standing over him with a coldness that transformed his face into something monstrous. "This is what happens to people who choose the wrong side," Derek said, his words meant for Emma as much as Miguel. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive, and Emma rode with Miguel to the hospital in Hamilton, holding his hand while he struggled to breathe through broken ribs and what the paramedics suspected was a punctured lung. The doctors admitted him immediately, and as Emma sat in the sterile waiting room while they worked on him, she understood with crystalline clarity that Derek had crossed a line from financial crime into physical violence, that his desperation had made him capable of anything, and that she was almost certainly next on his list. She called Ruth from the hospital and explained what had happened, and the elderly waitress's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "You're not going back to that ranch. You're staying with me until this is over. Pack whatever you can carry, and I'll pick you up in an hour." By nightfall, Emma was installed in Ruth's small apartment above the diner, her few possessions stuffed into her duffel bag, and Jennifer Martinez was on the phone, updating her that Derek's assault on Miguel had been added to the case file, and that criminal charges were being pursued in addition to the civil action. But Jennifer's voice carried a warning that chilled Emma to her core. "He's desperate now, Emma. Desperate people are the most dangerous. Stay somewhere safe, stay somewhere public, and don't go anywhere alone until we get him in front of a judge." Jennifer Martinez was the kind of lawyer who didn't stop at the surface of a case, and as she dug deeper into Derek's financial dealings, following the paper trails of shell companies and offshore accounts with the tenacity of a bloodhound, she uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond a simple case of estate fraud. 3 days after filing the injunction, she called Emma at Ruth's apartment with news that transformed their understanding of what they were fighting. "I need you to understand the scale of what we're dealing with," Jennifer said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Derek didn't just steal your grandmother's ranch for himself. He'd already sold it, or at least the most valuable parts of it, to Cascade Development Corporation. I found contracts dated 2 weeks before your grandmother's death, agreements to sell water rights and mineral rights for $2 million, contingent on Derek obtaining clear title to the property." Emma's hand tightened on the phone, her mind struggling to process the enormity of the betrayal. Jennifer continued, her words coming faster as she laid out what she'd discovered. "Cascade has been trying to consolidate ranch land in this valley for over a decade, buying up small operations and turning them into industrial, agricultural facilities. Your grandmother's ranch sits on top of one of the largest underground aquifers in the region, and recent geological surveys suggest possible mineral deposits, maybe even rare earth elements worth tens of millions. Derek knew this, or somebody told him, and he saw a way to solve all his problems at once." Jennifer explained that she'd obtained Derek's financial records through a court order, and they painted a picture of a man drowning in debt, owing over $300,000 to a gambling syndicate that operated out of Nevada, and had a reputation for extreme violence when collecting what they were owed. The $2 million from Cascade would have cleared his debts and left him with enough to disappear, to start over somewhere his past couldn't reach him. "But here's where it gets worse," Jennifer said. "The contract has a time limit. If Derek doesn't deliver clear title within 6 months of signing, the deal becomes void, and he has to return the advance payment he's already received, which was $500,000, money he's already spent paying down his most immediate debts. The injunction froze everything, and Cascade's CEO, a man named Richard Vance, is furious. I've seen communications between their lawyers and Marcus Brennan, where Vance is demanding that Derek resolve the situation immediately, threatening legal action for breach of contract if he doesn't." Emma felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. What does that mean? What will they do? Jennifer's pause was heavy with implication. Cascade Development is worth billions, and Richard Vance didn't build that empire by accepting defeat gracefully. He has lawyers, he has political connections, and he has resources that make Derek look like a small-time criminal. But more than that, he has a timeline. Every day the injunction stays in place is another day his deal falls apart. Men like Vance don't just pressure. They eliminate obstacles. And right now, Emma, you're the obstacle. Emma woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass, a sharp, crystalline crash that pulled her from fitful sleep into immediate adrenaline-fueled alertness. She stumbled to the window of Ruth's spare bedroom and looked down at the street below to see a dark sedan speeding away, its tail lights disappearing around the corner before she could make out a license plate. In the pale glow of the streetlights, she could see Miguel's borrowed truck parked at the curb, and even from 2 stories up, she could tell something was wrong. She pulled on clothes and ran downstairs, Ruth following behind her in a bathrobe, both of them stepping out into the cold night air to discover that all 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber shredded with systematic thoroughness, and tucked under the windshield wiper was a folded piece of paper. Emma's hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing a message printed in block letters. "Leave now or face consequences." The paper was standard printer stock, untraceable, but the message was clear, and the timing calculated to maximize fear. Ruth stood beside her, staring at the note, her face pale in the streetlight. "We need to call the police," she said, but Emma shook her head, knowing that Sheriff Hendricks was in Derek's pocket, and that reporting this would accomplish nothing except letting their enemies know they were frightened. They went back inside and tried to sleep, but an hour later, Ruth's phone rang with a call from the night manager at the Copper Kettle. His voice panicked as he explained that someone had thrown bricks through the diner's front windows and spray-painted a message across the remaining glass in letters 3 feet high. "Keep your mouth shut." The vandalism was professional, fast, and coordinated with the attack on Emma's truck, designed to send a message that everyone who helped her would pay a price. By the time the sun rose, Emma and Ruth stood in front of the diner, surveying the damage, broken glass glittering on the sidewalk like scattered diamonds, the spray-painted words dripping red down the windows like blood, and Ruth's hands trembled as she calculated the cost of repairs on a business that operated on razor-thin margins. "I'm sorry," Emma said, her voice breaking with guilt. "This is because of me. Because you helped me." Ruth turned to her, and instead of fear or anger, her weathered face showed nothing but fierce determination. "This is because evil men think they can terrorize good people into silence. They picked the wrong waitress to intimidate." The third attack came that afternoon, when Emma visited Miguel in the hospital, finding him pale and weak but improving, his broken ribs wrapped tightly, and his breathing less labored than it had been. She was sitting beside his bed, updating him on Jennifer's discoveries about Cascade Development, when a man in an expensive suit walked into the room with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. He was tall and well-groomed, perhaps 40, with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Miguel Reyes," the man said, not introducing himself. "I heard about your accident. Terrible thing. I hope you're recovering well." Miguel stared at him with open hostility. "Who are you?" The man ignored the question, moving closer to the bed. "Accidents happen on ranches all the time. Falls, equipment malfunctions, animals that spook at the wrong moment. A man your age should be thinking about retirement, somewhere safe, somewhere far away from dangerous work. It would be a shame if your accident happened again. Maybe something worse next time, something permanent." Emma was on her feet immediately, her voice sharp. "Get out, or I'll call security." The man gave her a dismissive glance, then turned back to Miguel with a final warning. "Think about what I said, old man. Some fights aren't worth dying for." Jennifer Martinez had secured a court date for the emergency hearing, scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Thursday in the Missoula County Courthouse, far enough from Hamilton that Derek's local influence would carry less weight, but close enough that witnesses could attend without unreasonable hardship. Sarah Collins was the linchpin of their case, the only person besides Derek and Marcus Brennan who had been present during the coercion, the only witness who could testify to what had actually happened in Helen Morrison's bedroom during those final terrible weeks. Emma had stayed in contact with Sarah through carefully arranged phone calls, and she could hear the fear in the nurse's voice growing with each conversation, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like a physical burden. "They'll destroy me," Sarah said during one call, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll never work as a nurse again. Derek will make sure of it, and Cascade Development has enough money to bury me in lawsuits." But Emma, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, talked her through the fear, reminding her that staying silent meant living with guilt forever, that justice for Helen Morrison was worth the risk, and that Jennifer Martinez would protect her as much as the law allowed. By the time the hearing was 2 days away, Sarah had committed to testifying, had driven to Helena to meet with Jennifer and give a formal deposition, and had returned to her small rental house in Butte, feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated by her decision. The attack came at 11:30 the night before the hearing, when Sarah was preparing for bed, going over her testimony one last time, trying to calm her nerves enough to sleep. She heard the sound of breaking glass from her back door, followed by heavy footsteps in her kitchen, and she had just enough time to grab her phone and lock herself in the bathroom before 2 men began pounding on the door, their voices muffled but menacing, as they told her that testifying would be a mistake she'd regret for the rest of her very short life. Sarah called Emma with shaking hands, whispering desperately into the phone while the pounding continued, and Emma, who was staying in a motel near the courthouse in preparation for the hearing, immediately called Jennifer Martinez, who in turn contacted the Montana State Police with a request for emergency intervention. The state police took the threat seriously, dispatching 2 units to Sarah's address with sirens wailing, and when the officers arrived, they found the intruders fleeing through the backyard, though they managed to apprehend one of them, a man with a criminal record who, when pressured, admitted he'd been hired by someone connected to Derek Morrison to convince the nurse to stay home. Sarah was placed in protective custody that night, relocated to a secure location under police guard, and Jennifer filed an emergency motion documenting the witness intimidation, adding it to the ever-growing list of crimes Derek and his associates had committed, each new transgression strengthening their case while simultaneously revealing the depths of desperation and criminality they were fighting against. The Missoula County Courthouse was a building of stone and glass that spoke of justice and permanence, and Courtroom 3 on the 2nd floor was packed beyond capacity when Judge Eleanor Price took her seat at 9:55 on Thursday morning, 5 minutes before the scheduled hearing. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table beside Jennifer Martinez, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking, while across the aisle, Derek sat with Marcus Brennan, both men dressed in expensive suits that projected confidence and respectability, the image of upstanding citizens defending themselves against frivolous accusations. The air felt heavy with anticipation, spectators filling every available seat, some standing along the back wall, drawn by news of a case that had become the talk of 2 counties, a David and Goliath story that had captured the attention of everyone who had ever felt powerless against wealth and influence. Judge Price was a woman in her early 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes behind frameless glasses, and a reputation for having no patience for lawyers who wasted her time or litigants who abused the system, and she called the hearing to order with a crack of her gavel that silenced the murmuring crowd. Marcus Brennan stood first, his opening statement a masterpiece of misdirection and emotional manipulation, painting Derek as a devoted nephew who had cared for his dying aunt in her final weeks, who had honored her last wishes even though it meant accepting the heavy burden of managing a struggling ranch, and who now found himself under attack by a young woman who had abandoned her grandmother for years and appeared only after death made a claim on an inheritance she had never earned. He spoke with the smooth confidence of a man who had won many cases through sheer force of personality, his gestures calculated, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotional beats, describing Emma as an opportunist who had never visited her grandmother, never called, never showed any interest until money was at stake, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had been a child in an orphanage with no means to travel. His words were designed to make the judge see Emma as the villain and Derek as the victim, and for a terrible moment Emma feared it might work, feeling the weight of every judgmental stare from the spectators who didn't know her story. But then Jennifer Martinez stood, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees as she began to methodically dismantle every lie Marcus Brennan had constructed. She started with the bank records, displaying them on a screen for the judge to see, showing the systematic theft of $50,000 during Helen Morrison's final month, each withdrawal corresponding exactly with Derek's documented visits, money that had flowed directly to paying off gambling debts to a Nevada crime syndicate. She presented Miguel's photographs showing Derek selling off prize cattle specifically protected in the original will, evidence of asset stripping that began within days of Helen's death, and contracts showing the illegal sale of water rights to Cascade Development Corporation. Deals worth millions that Derek had negotiated even before his aunt had died. Then came the medical records, testimony from 3 independent doctors who reviewed Helen Morrison's prescriptions and concluded that she had been systematically over-medicated with drugs that would cause confusion and cognitive impairment, creating a false picture of dementia that made her appear incapable of managing her own affairs, when in fact her mind had been sharp until those medications clouded it. Sarah Collins took the stand next, her face pale but her voice steady as she described what she had witnessed, the threats Derek had made, the fear in Helen Morrison's eyes, the way Marcus Brennan had pushed papers in front of a dying woman who was too terrified for her granddaughter's safety to refuse. And when she broke down, crying, while describing Helen's final pleading words, even some of the skeptical spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And then Jennifer played the recording, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that every word was crystal clear. Derek's cold voice, threatening to destroy Emma's life at the orphanage. Helen's broken pleading, the sound of a strong woman being crushed by fear and coercion. And when it ended, when the last terrible words faded into static, Judge Eleanor Price's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Derek and Marcus Brennan, with the intensity of someone who had just witnessed a profound violation of everything the law was meant to protect, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. Judge Eleanor Price did not mince words when she turned her attention to Marcus Brennan, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade forged in righteous anger. "Counselor Brennan, you have sat here and listened to evidence of elder abuse, coercion, and fraud. Yet you continue to defend the validity of a will you personally drafted and notarized. I am giving you one opportunity to explain yourself before I refer this matter to the State Bar Association and the District Attorney for Criminal Prosecution. I suggest you choose your words very carefully." Marcus Brennan's polished facade began to crack, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the courtroom, his hands gripping the table in front of him with white-knuckled intensity. Jennifer Martinez seized the moment, standing and addressing the judge with precision. "Your Honor, I would like to cross-examine Mr. Brennan regarding his financial records, specifically deposits totaling $30,000 made to his personal account in the 2 weeks following Helen Morrison's death. Deposits that cannot be explained by his normal business income." Marcus's head snapped toward Derek, a look of pure panic crossing his face, and in that moment, Emma saw the alliance between them begin to disintegrate, each man realizing that loyalty meant nothing when prison loomed on the horizon. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice cracking, "I request immunity in exchange for my full cooperation." Judge Price's eyes narrowed. "You are not in a position to negotiate, Counselor, but I will take your cooperation into account when considering charges. Now talk." What followed was a confession that seemed to drain all the air from the courtroom, Marcus Brennan's words tumbling out in a desperate rush as he tried to save himself by destroying his co-conspirator. He admitted that Derek had approached him 2 months before Helen Morrison's death with a plan to create a new will. That Derek had paid him $30,000 from money stolen from his aunt's accounts, and that when Helen had refused to sign the new will willingly, they had coerced her with threats against Emma, recording a signature session that was fundamentally invalid because it was obtained under duress. But the most damning revelation came when Marcus admitted that even the signature on the will was not genuine. "We used a signature stamp," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word a nail in his professional coffin. "Derek had one made from a cancelled check, an old one from years ago, when Helen's hand was steadier. The signature on the will looks perfect because it's mechanical, not human. I witnessed and notarized a document I knew was forged, and I did it because I was in debt to the same people Derek owed money to, and he promised me enough to clear what I owed, and then some." Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she listened, not tears of sadness, but of vindication, of knowing that every instinct she'd had about that signature being wrong had been correct. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, and Emma saw Derek's face transform from arrogance to stark terror as he realized his carefully constructed lies were collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, with a sound that cut through the chaos, and for a moment everyone thought he was simply reacting to the betrayal. But then he turned and bolted toward the courtroom doors, shoving past spectators in a desperate attempt to flee. He made it perhaps 10 feet before 2 bailiffs intercepted him, their hands closing on his arms with professional efficiency, and they dragged him back to the front of the courtroom while he shouted incoherently about injustice and conspiracies, his composure completely shattered, the mask of respectability finally ripped away to reveal the desperate criminals underneath. Judge Eleanor Price called for order, her gavel striking 3 times with the finality of a pronouncement from on high, and when the courtroom fell silent, she delivered her ruling with a voice that left no room for appeal or argument. "I have presided over this bench for 17 years, and in that time I have seen many examples of human greed and cruelty. But what has been revealed in this courtroom today represents a profound violation of the most sacred trust we have as a society, the protection of our vulnerable elderly from those who would exploit their weakness for personal gain. The evidence presented is overwhelming and irrefutable." The will dated October 3rd, which was filed with this court and used to transfer the Morrison estate to Derek Morrison, is hereby declared null and void on the grounds that it was obtained through coercion, elder abuse, and outright forgery. The signature was not genuine. The circumstances surrounding its execution were criminal, and every party involved in its creation knew they were perpetrating a fraud. She turned her fierce gaze on Derek, who stood between the 2 bailiffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his face drained of all color. "Mr. Morrison, you systematically abused, threatened, and robbed your dying aunt, a woman who had shown you nothing but kindness throughout your life. You stole her money, you terrorized her in her final days, and you attempted to steal the legacy she intended for her granddaughter. I am issuing a warrant for your immediate arrest on charges of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, theft, and assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm in connection with the attack on Miguel Reyes. Bailiffs, take him into custody." Derek was led away in handcuffs, his protests falling on deaf ears, and Emma watched him disappear through the courtroom doors with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief that justice was actually being served. Judge Price continued, her attention now on Marcus Brennan, who sat slumped in his chair like a man who had aged a decade in the past hour. "Mr. Brennan, you violated every ethical standard of your profession. You forged legal documents, you participated in elder abuse, and you betrayed the trust placed in you as an officer of the court. I am referring this matter to the State Bar Association with a recommendation for immediate disbarment, and I am ordering you to remain in this jurisdiction pending criminal charges. You are a disgrace to the legal profession." Marcus nodded numbly, unable to meet anyone's eyes, his career and reputation destroyed by his own greed and moral weakness. Then Judge Price turned to the matter of Cascade Development Corporation, and her expression, if possible, grew even harder. "The contracts for water rights and mineral rights that Derek Morrison illegally negotiated with Cascade Development Corporation are void. The corporation's due diligence was either criminally negligent or deliberately designed to ignore the questionable circumstances of Mr. Morrison's claim to the property. I am imposing a fine of $5 million on Cascade Development for their role in this conspiracy, and I am referring the matter to the federal authorities for investigation into whether this represents a pattern of predatory behavior toward vulnerable landowners. Mr. Richard Vance and his corporation will face the full weight of the law." Finally, Judge Price's expression softened as she looked at Emma, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was something approaching gentleness in her stern features. "Miss Morrison, I am recognizing you as the sole legitimate heir to the estate of Helen Morrison. The ranch, all property, all assets, and all rights associated with that estate are hereby returned to you, effective immediately. I am also ordering Derek Morrison to pay restitution for all assets he sold or transferred, all money he stole, and all damages caused by his criminal actions. Furthermore, I am awarding you compensatory damages in the amount of $500,000 for the suffering and hardship you endured as a result of his crimes." Emma stood on trembling legs, Jennifer Martinez's hand steadying her shoulder, and tried to process what she was hearing. The ranch was hers. After months of fighting, after the fear and the threats and the violence, after watching good people like Miguel and Ruth suffer for helping her, justice had finally prevailed. She looked around the courtroom at the faces of those who had believed in her. Ruth, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, Miguel in a wheelchair with his ribs still healing, but his eyes bright with vindication. Sarah Collins, who had found the courage to tell the truth despite her terror, and Jennifer Martinez, who had fought like a warrior for a client who couldn't pay her a single dollar. Emma's vision blurred with tears, and she felt something break open in her chest, a flood of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. But it was not grief or anger or fear. It was hope, pure and fierce, and finally justified. Emma returned to the ranch on a bright October morning, 3 weeks after the hearing, driving up the familiar dirt road in a truck she now legally owned, with Miguel sitting beside her in the passenger seat, his ribs still wrapped but healing well, his smile wide and genuine for the first time since Derek had appeared in their lives. The main house stood as it always had, solid and weathered, but now it felt different, transformed from a contested battleground into something that was finally, truly hers. And as she climbed the porch steps and pushed open the front door, she felt her grandmother's presence in every creaking board and shaft of dusty sunlight. Miguel officially resumed his position as foreman that very day, refusing to even consider retirement despite his age and recent injuries, saying that Helen Morrison had hired him 30 years ago, and he intended to honor that commitment by teaching her granddaughter everything she needed to know about running a ranch. Together they walked the property, assessing the damage Derek had done in his brief reign of greed, making lists of what needed to be restored, what stock needed to be repurchased, what fences needed mending, and what relationships with neighboring ranchers needed to be rebuilt. Ruth arrived the next day with cleaning supplies, food, and the fierce determination of a woman who had waited decades to see justice served, and she helped Emma tackle the main house room by room, scrubbing away the neglect and disorder Derek had left behind. opening windows to let fresh mountain air drive out the staleness of corruption, and slowly restoring the home to something that would have made Helen Morrison proud. It was Ruth who suggested Emma move into her grandmother's bedroom rather than choosing one of the guest rooms, saying that the space was meant for the woman of the house. And though Emma hesitated at first, worried about disturbing sacred ground, she finally agreed, understanding that claiming that room was part of claiming her inheritance fully. They cleaned it together, washing windows until they sparkled, beating dust from the faded quilt, polishing the old furniture until it gleamed. And when they opened the closet to sort through her grandmother's clothes, deciding what to keep and what to donate, Emma found something that made her sink to her knees on the worn wooden floor. The closet was deeper than it appeared, and in the very back, stacked carefully on shelves that had been built specifically for this purpose, were dozens of cardboard boxes, each one labeled with a year and Emma's name. With trembling hands, Emma opened the first box, dated when she was 5 years old, and inside were all the drawings she had made at the orphanage and sent to her grandmother, crude crayon pictures of horses and mountains, and families holding hands, each one carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve to protect it from time and damage. The second box held letters, Emma's childish handwriting describing her days, her dreams, her small triumphs and disappointments, every single letter she had ever written over 13 years, saved and treasured, and read so many times the creases were wearing through. There were photographs, too, sent from the orphanage at birthdays and holidays, showing Emma growing from a small, uncertain child into a teenager, and on the back of each photograph, in her grandmother's shaky script, were notes: Emma, age 7, already so strong. Emma, age 10, has her mother's eyes. Emma, age 14, I miss her every day. Ruth sat beside her on the floor, and together they went through box after box, a complete archive of a love that had never wavered despite the distance and the years, and Emma understood with a clarity that was both painful and healing that she had never been forgotten, had never been unloved, that every day of her lonely childhood her grandmother had been thinking of her, missing her, saving every precious scrap of connection between them, and waiting for the day when Emma would finally come home. 6 months had passed since Judge Eleanor Price's gavel had fallen and changed the course of Emma's life. 6 months of hard work and healing and slow, steady transformation that had touched not just the ranch, but Emma herself in ways she was still discovering. Spring had come to the Montana valleys, melting the last of winter's snow and coaxing the grasslands into brilliant green life, and the ranch that had been dying under Derek's mismanagement was thriving once more, a testament to what dedication and love could accomplish when given the chance. Emma had hired 3 new ranch hands, young people from neighboring properties who wanted to learn sustainable ranching practices, and together with Miguel they had rebuilt the herds, purchasing breeding stock to replace the prize cattle Derek had sold off, restoring the genetic lines her grandmother had spent decades perfecting. She had implemented rotational grazing systems her grandmother had written about in her journals, practices that healed the land while improving the cattle's health, and she had repaired every fence, every gate, every building that Derek's greed had left to deteriorate. The work was endless and exhausting, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from dawn to dusk physical labor, but it was honest work that left her sleeping soundly through the nights, without the nightmares that had plagued her at the orphanage. Miguel had become the grandfather she had never known, patient and wise, teaching her how to read the weather in the mountains, how to doctor a sick calf, how to negotiate with buyers, and when to stand firm on price, sharing stories of her grandmother as a young woman that made Emma laugh and cry in equal measure. Ruth visited every Sunday, bringing food and laughter, and a steady presence that reminded Emma she was no longer alone in the world, and even Sarah Collins had come to visit once, nervous but healing, saying that testifying had lifted a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. On the anniversary of her arrival, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off that Greyhound bus with nothing but a duffel bag and a dream, Emma stood on the porch of the main house as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. She looked out over 800 hectares of land that was finally, legally, unquestionably hers, at cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that stretched to the horizon, at mountains that stood eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to all the struggles and triumphs that had played out in their shadows. She thought about the frightened girl who had arrived here a year ago, alone and uncertain, with no family and no place in the world, and she barely recognized that person in the woman she had become, someone who had fought powerful men and won, who had learned to run a ranch and make hard decisions, who had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The ranch was not just her inheritance anymore, not just a piece of paper that said she owned land. It was her home, earned through determination and sacrifice, defended with the help of people who had believed in justice, even when justice seemed impossible. She had found more than property in these mountains. She had found family in Miguel and Ruth, and all the others who had stood with her. She had found purpose in the daily work of caring for the land and the animals, and she had found the roots she had craved her entire life, connections to a past and a future that stretched beyond her solitary existence. As the last light faded, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma whispered a quiet thank you to the grandmother she had barely known, but who had loved her enough to leave her everything, and she made a silent promise to honor that legacy, to build something lasting and good on the foundation of sacrifice and love, to never forget where she came from or the price that had been paid for her to stand here, free and whole, and finally, completely home.